The Shadow on the Blind and Other Ghost Stories by Louisa Baldwin. Almost everyone, it has been said, would be angry if anyone else reported that he believed in ghosts, yet hardly anyone, when thinking by himself, wholly disbelieves them. Walter Bagehot. The Uncanny Bairn. A story of the second sight. David Galbraith owned a compact estate in East Lothian which he farmed at a considerable profit. The land had passed from father to son for a couple of 100 years. It had always yielded a good livelihood to the owner, but never had it been so highly cultivated or produced such abundant crops as under David Galbraith's liberal and skillful management. The oats and potatoes grown on his farm commanded the highest prices in the market, and his root crops were superior to any in the district. The large, solidly built stone house in which generations of Galbraiths had lived and died stood in the midst of the property, sheltered by a belt of trees on rising ground from the sweeping east wind. And the labourers' cottages, equally well constructed to resist the gales that blew across the Frith of Forth, were models of decent comfort. The livestock on the farm was well fed and cared for. The whole property bore evidence to the wealth, thrift, and intelligence of its owner. And David Galbraith's wife was well-to-do and thrifty like himself. She too was the child of a lowland landowner and farmer, and brought her husband no inconsiderable tocher, dowry. While her industry and housewifely accomplishments might in themselves have served as a marriage portion. She too, like her husband, came of a douce Presbyterian stock, worthy, upright folk, holding by the faith and practice of their forebears, orthodox and thrifty, worshipping as their fathers had done, and hoarding the gear as tightly, nothing doubting but that to them was especially assigned not only the good things of this world, but also of that which is to come. Galbraith did not marry till he was a middle-aged man. But he had long had the cares of a family on his shoulders without its pleasures to lighten the burden. He was the eldest of 6 orphan sisters and brothers, to whom he had acted the part of a father. And it was not till Colin, the last and youngest, had left Scotland for a sheep run in Australia, with money lent him by his brother, that he felt himself at liberty to marry. But now that his pious duty towards his family was fulfilled, David Galbraith did not hesitate to take to himself a wife in the person of Miss Alison McGillivray, a lady of some 35 years of age, with large hands and feet, small grey eyes, high cheekbones, and a complexion betokening exposure to a harsh climate. She was well educated and intelligent, and in talking with her servants and poor neighbours, commonly fell into the comfortable lowland Scotch that her father and mother had taken a pride in speaking. Only one child was born to David and his wife in the ample home where there was space, maintenance, and welcome for a dozen. Yet this one was a son, and the Galbraiths were not doomed to die out. The boy was christened Alexander, after his 2 grandfathers, both of whom were Alexanders, so that there was no chance of dispute as to which side of the house should have the naming of the child. And a poor wee, frail child he was, apparently inheriting nothing of the strength and vigour of the Galbraiths and McGillivrays, nor did he resemble father or mother in feature. He seemed a little foreigner that had come to stay with them for a while, and often in his feeble infancy he bade fair to depart and leave his parents childless. The shrewd bracing winds, that were life and health to them, nipped and shrivelled him. He took every ailment that was to be had, and when there was nothing catching in the neighbourhood, he would originate some illness of his own, severe enough to have shaken the constitution of any but a seasoned weakling like himself. The lowland farmer would hang over the cradle of his waxen-faced baby, holding his breath for very fear as he looked at the puny thing, and would say, dropping into broad Scotch, as his wont was when strongly moved, "Wha wad ken this for a bairn o' mine, sae strang and bonny and we'll set up as the Galbraiths have I been." But the babe won through the troubles and perils of his sickly infancy, and at 6 years of age had grown into a delicate slip of a child, with an interesting pair of grey eyes in his pale face, and a bright spark of intellect in his big head. The family doctor, to whose unceasing care Sandy owed his life almost as much as to his mother's devoted nursing, forbade his parents to attempt anything in the way of systematic education till the boy was 8 or 9 years of age. "Canna ye be content to let weel alan," he would say, "and bide till the bairn's strang and healthy before ye trouble him to read and write? Gin ye set his brains ablees wi' letters and figures, he'll just be burnin' down the house that's meant to be the habitation of a fine soul, gin ye wad houd your hands aff it, and leave it alan." And little Sandy did very well, though unable to read or write till long after the age at which the children of his father's labourers could spell out a psalm, and sign their names in a big round hand. But the child had a memory such as must have been commoner in the world before there were books to refer to at every turn than it is now, and his mind was stored with fairy tales and old border ballads that his mother and his nurse told or sung to him in the winter evenings. But Mrs. Galbraith and Effie were careful never to tell him stories of a weird or ghostly nature, for the doctor had impressed upon them before all things that Sandy must never be frightened. "For gin the bairn be frighted he will na sleep," said the astute mistress to the maid, "and ye'll just hae to sit the lang mirk evenings by his bed, while ye hear the maids daffin by candlelight below, or walking wi' their laddies, but gin ye never let him hear o' ghasts and wraiths, he'll just sleep like a bird wi' its head under its wing, and whiles ye'll be able to leave him and hae a crack wi' your neebours like ony i' the body." Though mother and nurse, actuated by different but equally strong motives, kept all knowledge of the supernatural from the child, there came a day when his father accused them both of poisoning his mind with stories of witches, warlocks and ghosts, and making an uncanny bairn of the boy. When Sandy was 7 years of age, a lean and overgrown child without his front teeth, and any comeliness he might possess existed only in his mother's eyes, a strange circumstance happened that greatly perplexed and distressed his parents. One cold afternoon late in October, Mrs. Galbraith told Effie to take a pudding and a can of broth to an old and very poor woman, called Elspeth McPhee, who lived in a lone cottage a mile from the farm, and Sandy was to go with her for the sake of the walk. The trees were already stripped by the autumn gales, to which a dead calm succeeded, and a cold fog had crept up from the sea and brooded over the bare fields, settling on the naked boughs in chilly drops of moisture. The careful mother wrapped a plaid round the boy, and bade him run as he went, to keep himself warm. Away sped Sandy along the high road, driving a ball before him, running after it to send it flying again with a dexterous blow of his stick, till his pale cheeks glowed with exercise, and he overshot his mark, ran past old Elspeth's cottage, and had to be recalled by Effie. "Ye maun put the basket in her hand your ain sell," she said, as she led the reluctant child into the dark close room where the old woman sat shivering by the fire, spreading her skinny hands over the dying embers. But Sandy held back, and neither threatening nor coaxing would induce him to move a step nearer to Elspeth, so that, stigmatizing him as a dour limb, Effie was obliged to set the basket on the table herself. "It's just a pudding and a few broth that Mistress Galbraith has sent ye, for she's I mind fu o' the pure," she said, as she set out the can and bowl before the old woman. Elspeth looked with a bitter smile at the good things spread before her. "It's a very good sae far as it gies, but gin I'd been the rich body, and Mistress Galbraith the pure Carleen, I would hae sent her a muchkin o' something stronger than mutton broth. Does she no warm her ain thrapple wi' a drap whisky hersel? For shame, Elspeth. Ye maun just tak what's sent ye and be thankfu," said Effie sharply, and turning to Sandy, who stood gazing intently at the old woman, "What ails the bairn that he canna tak his eyes aff your face? It's no your beauty, I'm thinking, Elspeth, that draws him sae." The ill-favoured old woman cackled to herself, displaying a few yellow tusks, the last survivors of a set of teeth that had once been as white and strong as Effie's. "It's lang since Manor Bairn looked at old Elspeth wi' sic a gaze. What does the bairn see in an old wife's face? Ye suld look at the lasses, Sandy, lad," and Elspeth stretched out her lean arm, caught the boy by the wrist, and drew him towards her. She was a hideous old woman, and in the gathering twilight, when the red glare of the embers shed a glow on her harsh features, she appeared positively witch-like. Sandy suffered himself to be drawn close to her as one who walks in his sleep, with wide-open eyes void of expression, and then stood opposite her for a moment pale and silent. Before either of the women could speak, the child's voice was heard. What for hae ye bawbees on your een, Elspeth McPhee, and a white claith lappet under your chin? Old Elspeth dropped Sandy's hand and sank back with a groan. Effie, Effie, hark till him. The bairn has the second sight, and he sees me strick it for the grave, aye, and ye'll all see it soon. I feel the mools upon me already. Tak him awa, he's an awesome bairn. And Sandy quietly put on his cap and went out into the cold mist. Effie followed him, and relieved her fright and agitation by speaking sharply to the child. For shame of yoursel, Sandy, to fright an old woman wi' gruesome words that ye never heard from your mither nor me. But what for sould Elspeth be frighted? There were bawbees on her een, and a white claith round her heed, and I just told her aboot it, and gin I see the like of it on your face, Effie, I will tell ye. My certie. But ye'll be burnt for a warlock gin ye read folks' deaths on their faces, and ye'd best howd your clavers. And Effie said no more, but thought much on her way back to the farm. She was sure that Sandy did not know the meaning of his own words. He had never seen a dead body, and he did not know how a corpse is prepared for the grave, and he certainly had no information on the subject from books, for he could not read. And the appearance he described on old Elspeth's face did not seem to frighten him. He had gazed at her from the moment in which they entered the cottage till they left it, but with wonder and interest rather than fear. The fright was for Elspeth McPhee and herself, and as she watched the child, unconscious of the death wound he had given, bounding along the road still playing with his ball and stick, Effie shuddered with vague and nameless fears. That night at supper Effie told her fellow servants of Sandy's weird words, and they took counsel together whether his mother should be told about it or not, and they decided only to speak to her if anything untoward happened to old Elspeth. It was on Thursday that Effie had been sent to Elspeth McPhee's cottage, and she resolved to go there again on her own account on the following Sunday afternoon. Her native superstitions were strong upon her, though she had never imparted them to her young charge, and she drew near to Elspeth's cottage with a boding heart. It scarcely surprised her, when she entered to find old Elspeth lying dead on the bed, with coins on her eyes and a white cloth bound round her head, precisely as Sandy had seen her on Thursday. 2 women were in the room with the dead, eager to tell how Elspeth had taken to her bed on Thursday evening, refused bit or sup, and had died early that morning. Effie trembled, but merely asked of what old Elspeth had died, for 3 days before she seemed in no likelihood of death. But the only account the women could give of her sudden death was that she appeared to have had no illness at all, and that she had said, "I'm no a sick woman, but a dying, and I mourn gay." Effie hastened home to tell her mistress everything, repeating faithfully every word that old Elspeth and Sandy had said on the previous Thursday. And Mrs. Galbraith listened with a white and awe-struck face. "Ye'll just say naething about it, Effie, it'll be a sair prejudice against the poor bairn, and stand in his way, gin folks think Sandy has the second sight." And Effie did not think it necessary to mention that every servant in the house was acquainted with the result of her visit to old Elspeth's cottage. But she hinted that if she continued to wait on such an awesome bairn, that might see the death tokens on her face any day, and fright her into an early grave, her wages should be raised in proportion to the danger of her service. When Mrs. Galbraith told her husband of Sandy's ghastly remark, its tragic result, and the child's unconsciousness in the matter, he disguised the fears that possessed him beneath a bluster of wrath, and rated her and Effie soundly. "It stands to reason that the bairn canna speak o' what he does na ken, and you and Effie, but mair likely Effie than you, for I was used to think you a woman of sense, hae been telling Sandy old wives' tales about the second sight, till he thinks it a fine thing to practice what ye've taught him, and the all-doited fool Elspeth dies out o' sheer fright in consequence, and ye maun see for your ain sell what your ain folly has brought about." But Mrs. Galbraith protested that neither she nor Effie had ever uttered a word about the second sight in the boy's hearing. And David, who in his heart believed his wife, though he did not deem it consistent with his dignity to own as much, abruptly ended the unpleasant affair by saying peremptorily, I'll no permit the bairn to be told any mair ungodly superstitions and old wives' tales. If he may gang to the deal, and Sandy sail be wi me in his walks and rides, and I's warrant ye'll hear naething from him but what he learns fra me, guid sense and sound doctrine. And Effie was dismissed, to her own great relief, and from that day forth Sandy became his father's outdoor companion, to the visible benefit of his health and spirits. But no one was so really alarmed at Sandy's uncanny remark and its consequences as David Galbraith himself. His grandmother, a Highland woman, had had the second sight, and his father had told him how she lived to become the terror of her family. Her premonitions of death and calamity were unfailingly true, and the spirit within her never enlightened her as to how the impending evil might be averted. She was simply the medium announcing approaching doom. What if her ghostly gift had descended to her grandson, a barren heritage, that would make him shunned by his kind? Poor Alison Galbraith, finding her husband irritable and unreasonable on the subject of Sandy's weird speech, sought comfort in pouring out her fears to their minister, the Reverend Ewan Macfarlane, who gave ear to her with as much patience as could be expected from a man whose chief business it was in life to speak and not to listen. He drew the very worst inference from what he heard. It's a clear case of the second sight, and I canna but fear that there may be war to come. When the uncanny spirit lights on a body, there's nae predicting what its manifestations may be, and for aught that we ken it may be you or me that Sandy'll see the death tokens on neist. And if ye continue to bring him to the kirk, I wad request that ye'll no let him sit glowering at me, for though sudden death wad doubtless be sudden glory to me, it wad no be consistent wi' the dignity of a minister of the Free Kirk that he sould be harried untimely into his grave by an uncanny bairn, that wad hae been burnt for a warlock in times gone by. And if I was spared such a sair visitation, the bairn might yet be permitted to work a certain perturbation of spirit in me, that would cause me to curtail the word of God, and bring my discourse to a premature end, to the grievous loss of them that hear. And, Mistress Galbraith, let me tell ye, ye'll find to disrepute wi your neighbours gin Sandy sees bawbees on your minister's honoured een, and aught came of it to his prejudice. In the following spring David Galbraith's youngest brother Colin returned, after an absence of 10 years, to spend a few months with his relations in Scotland. His industry had been prospered in Australia, and he was in a better position than he could have attained by any exertions of his own in the old country. He and his nephew struck up a warm friendship together, and it was a pretty sight to see them golfing on the links at North Berwick, the strong man accommodating his play to that of the puny boy by his side, and restraining his speech so that not a word fell from his lips but what was fit for a child to hear. One day when they had played till Sandy was tired, they sauntered down to the beach, Uncle Colin to sit on the rocks, smoking his morning pipe, his nephew to perch beside him, and amuse himself with the shells and seaweed that abound there. Presently Sandy grew weary of sitting still, threw away the handful of shells he had picked up, and proposed that they should go further along the sands to where the children were bathing. "And gie me your hand, Uncle Colin, and I'll tell ye something while we walk that I canna just understand mysel. I've seen an unco strange thing, I've seen your house in Australia." "Hoot, mon. What havers are ye talking? Ye've been dreaming," said Uncle Colin cheerily. "Nah, I saw it. It was no dream. I ken weel the difference between dreaming and seeing. Your house has na slates on the roof, like our house. It was thicket like a hayrick, and it had a wide place round it covered with another little thicket roof, and windows like big glass doors opened on it. And there was fire all about, and tall grass all ablaze, and sheep rinning hither and thither frighted, and a man with a black beard and a gun in his hand ran out of the house and shouted, 'O'Grady, save the mare and foal. If they're lost, the master will never forgie ye. What ails ye, Uncle Colin, that ye look sae gash?' And the boy looked up in his uncle's face with wonder. 'It's no canny to see such a sight, Sandy. What do ye ken o' bush fires? And ye've never seen a picture of my house, and who told ye that my groom is an Irishman named O'Grady? For I've told naebody here, and the man with the black beard is my Scotch shepherd. There was no need to tell me anything about it, Uncle Colin, for I saw it but if the man at the door had na shouted O'Grady, then I sold na hae kenned his name. Colin made a poor attempt at laughter, that he might hide from the child how shocked and startled he was. But as soon as they reached home he told his brother about his son's vision, and heard from him in return the story of Sandy and old Elspeth. A few days later Colin Galbraith received a telegram from his head shepherd informing him of heavy loss he had just sustained from a very serious bush fire, and both he and David were convinced that Sandy was an uncanny bairn. Colin returned to Australia immediately afterwards, and as he parted from his brother and sister-in-law he said with a melancholy smile, "If ony mischance befalls me, ye'll ken as soon as I do mysel. Your awesome bairn will see it and ye may tak for gospel aught told ye by and that has the second sight." One fine afternoon, some 3 weeks after Colin had sailed, David, having just then no particular work to keep him on the farm all day, proposed for a great treat to row Sandy to the base rock. Oat cutting would shortly begin, and then he would not have a spare hour from morning to night. But today he and his son would enjoy a holiday together, and Sandy was to take with him the small gun that his father gave him on his last birthday, for he was now 9 years of age, and high time that he set about learning to kill something or other. All the latent boy seemed developed in the delicate child by the possession of the small fowling piece, and he blazed away at the rats under the hayricks and at the sparrows on the roof, to the peril alike of the poultry, of the bedroom windows. "Mother, mother, I'll shoot ye a gannet and mak ye a cushion o' the down," he shouted in wild excitement, as he set forth on the expedition. Mrs. Galbraith stood on the doorstep watching her husband and son leave the house together, David a stout, tall man in the prime of late middle life, red-faced and grey-haired, and Sandy a lanky lad with pale freckled face, but with more vigour in his step than the fond mother had ever expected to see. He carried his gun over his shoulder and strode along by his father's side, glancing up at him frequently to try to imitate his every look and gesture. David Galbraith was fond of rowing, and as it was a very calm day he dismissed the man in charge of the boat, and taking the oars himself said it would do him good to row as far as the base rock and back again. The sea was like a millpond, a glassy stretch of water with here and there a wind flaw wrinkling its smooth surface. There was not a wave that could have displaced a pebble on the beach, and masses of olive-green seaweed floated motionless in its clear depths. To the left, high above them, stood the ruins of Tantallon Castle, bathed in August sunshine, its grey walls taking warmth and colour from the glow of light that softened and beautified its rugged outline. Before them the sullen mass of the base rock towered above the blue water, circled by countless thousands of seabirds, the glitter of whose white wings was seen as silvery flashes of light, from a distance too great to distinguish the birds themselves. They were near enough to the shore to hear voices and laughter borne over the water from the grassy enclosure before Tantallon Castle, and lowing of kine in the pastures, and as they neared the base rock these sounds were exchanged for the squealing of wild fowl, and the clang of their wings. To Sandy's delight he was allowed to shoot from the boat, which he did with as little danger to the birds as to the fishes, and the only condition his father imposed was that he should fire with his back towards him, till your aim is mair precise. Monday, though it soon became evident even to the sanguine Sandy that he would bring home neither gannet nor kittiwake, it was a rapturous delight to be rowed about the island by his father, who told him the name of every bird he saw, and pointed out their nests on the precipitous face of the rock. Then David rested on his oars, and the boat scarcely moved on the still water while Sandy ate the oatcake and drank the milk provided for him by his mother, and his father took a deep draught from his flask till his face grew crimson. "Father, gie me a drink, too," said Sandy, stretching out his hand. "Nah, ye'll stick to your milk drinking till ye hae built up a strong frame, and then ye may tak as much whisky as ye will to keep it in good repair." And now the boat was turned landward once more, and they soon lost sound of the clang of the seabirds' wings, and the lowing of kine was again heard, and David rowed slowly past the rock of Tantallon. Sandy had fallen silent, and sat leaning his arm on the gunwale of the boat looking into the limpid water, dipping his hand into a soft, swelling wave, and scattering a shower of glittering drops from his fingers. Suddenly he ceased his play, and kneeling in the bottom of the boat, clung firmly to the side with both hands, leaned over and gazed intently in the water. His father, who was always on the alert where his son was concerned, at once noticed the change that had come over him, rowed quicker, and said cheerily, "What are ye glowering at, Mon? Did ye never see a herring in the sea before?" Sandy neither spoke nor stirred, and David took comfort in thinking that after all the lad could see nothing uncanny in the water, it was just some daft folly or other he was after, best unnoticed. But when Sandy did speak it was to utter words for which he was unprepared. "Father, I see Uncle Colin in the water wi' his face turned up to me, and his een wide open, but he canna see wi' them." And the boy did not raise his head, but continued to gaze into the water. Drops of sweat broke out on Galbraith's brow, and he lifted the dripping oars high in the rowlocks and leaned towards Sandy, his red face now as white as the boy's. "Whether it's God or the ye'll speaks in ye, I dinna ken, but ye'll drive me mad wi' your gruesome clavers. Howd up, man, and fling yoursel back in the boat, where ye'll see neathing more than yoursel." But Sandy did not stir. "It's Uncle Colin that I see floating in the water, lappet in seaweed, and he's nae sleeping, for his een stare sae wide," and Galbraith, who would not have looked over the gunwale of the boat for his life, with an oath plunged the oars deep into the water and rowed with furious strokes. "Ye've struck the oar on his white face," shrieked the boy, and fell back crying in the boat. A heavy gloom settled on the Galbraiths, and this last hideous vision of Sandy's they kept strictly to themselves. They did not seek counsel of their minister or of anyone. They were certain that Colin was drowned. It was a mere question of time when they could hear how it had happened, but hear it they assuredly would. And Sandy, too, was gloomy and depressed. "The bairn has frighted himself this time as weel as others," said his father, "and small blame to him. But I would rather follow him to the kirkyard than that he suld grow up with the second sight. It may hae been a verra weel in a breekless, starving Highlander 100 years ago, but it's no consistent for a well-fed Lowlander in these days o' trousers and high farming. How is Sandy to do justice to the land and mind the rotation of crops if he goes daft wi' the second sight?" The oat harvest was plentiful and got together in fine condition, but neither David nor his wife had any heart to enjoy it. They simply lived through each day waiting for the tidings that must come. Nor had they long to wait. A month after Sandy's vision David read in the newspaper of the safe arrival of his brother's ship at its destination. It reported a prosperous voyage with but one casualty during its course. On the 24th day after sailing, a passenger booked for Sydney had mysteriously fallen overboard in perfectly calm weather and was drowned. The gentleman's name was Mr. Colin Galbraith, and his sudden untimely end had cast a gloom over the ship's company. So far the newspaper report, which, brief as it was all that David and Alison could ever learn of their poor brother's fate. They carefully compared the dates, and found that Colin had been drowned 3 days after Sandy had seen the vision of the body in the sea. "I winna tell the bairn that puir Colin is dead," said David gloomily. "Ye'll just tell the bairn he's dead, but you'll say neathing of drowning. Ye maun do as ye think best, but I canna mention puir Colin's name to him." And it was from his mother that Sandy heard of his Uncle Colin's death. He listened gravely and thoughtfully to the tidings. "Aye, it was him that I saw in the water." And that was all that he had to say about the death of his favourite uncle. He asked no question and made no further remark. From this time forward a great change came over David Galbraith. From being wholly matter of fact and little inclined to believe more than his senses could attest, he became credulous and superstitious. He trembled at omens, and was unnerved for his day's work if his dreams overnight were unpropitious. He disliked being out on dark nights, and cast uneasy glances over his shoulder as though he heard steps behind him. At times when he was riding he thought that he heard someone following hard on his heels, and he would gallop for miles and reach home, horse and rider both in a sweat of fear. And Sandy, the unconscious cause of the evil change in his father, mutely wondered what had come over him. David scarcely let the boy out of his sight, though his society was a torment to him, and he was always wondering what would be the next shock he would receive. Unhappily he tried to restore tone to his shaken nerves by drinking, and the habit grew quickly on him, to his good wife's great distress. And times were now so changed that Sandy was often more frightened of his father than his father was of him. Mrs. Galbraith proposed sending Sandy to stay with some relations of her own at Linlithgow, thinking that it would do her husband good to have the strain of the boy's constant society removed for a while. But he would not hear of it, and merely said, "The bairn sail bide at hame. It's my ain weird, and I maun dree it." Some 2 years passed by in which Sandy had no visions, and grew steadily healthier and stronger and more like other boys of his age, so that his mother began to think they should make a man of him yet. But though his father noticed the physical improvement in his son with pride, nothing could persuade him that the dreaded gist had departed from him. In vain his wife tried to convince him that there was no further cause for anxiety. He shook his head and said, "Ye'll no get rid of an ill gift sae lightly. It's a fire that burns low, but it'll burst out into flame for a' that." In the third summer after Colin Galbraith was lost at sea, on a lovely summer evening, Mrs. Galbraith sat at the open window, knitting and smiling placidly, as she watched her son at work in his little plot of garden watering the tufts of pinks and pansies. She laid her work in her lap, and her eyes followed his every movement with quiet pleasure. Sandy would make a good gardener. There was not a weed nor a straggling growth in his plot, all was neat and trim. And the flower beds were prettily bordered with shells he had collected on the beach at North Berwick. He was gathering a posy with fastidious care, and his mother knew that it was for her, and thought to herself that if he had been uncanny in time past, he was a good boy, his heart was in the right place. But something disturbed him in his work. He rose from stooping over the bed, dropped his flowers to the ground, and Alison thought he was listening to some far-away sound, till a change that passed over his face showed her that she was mistaken. Sandy was not listening, he was seeing. His face grew pale and his features pinched, his grey eyes were fixed while the colour faded out of them till they were almost white, and he shuddered as though a cold wind blew over him. Mrs. Galbraith rose silently, and assured by the deep breathing of her husband, who was sitting in an armchair by the hearth, that he was asleep, opened the door, softly left the room and hurried into the garden. There in the sunshine, surrounded by summer sights and summer scents, stood Sandy, a very image of midnight terror. His mother laid her large warm hands on his shoulders, and gently shook him. "Sandy, Sandy, if you're seeing again, for God's sake say nothing to your father. He canna bear it, ye'll tell me," she said in a frightened whisper. The boy gave a sigh, passed his hands over his eyes, and staggered as though he were dizzy. Alison grasped her son firmly by the arm. "Come awa. If your father wakes and goes to the window he'll see us, come awa." And she hurried the boy through the warm evening sunshine that had suddenly grown cold and dim to her, and led him to a retired part of the garden. "And now what was it that ye saw?" And looking at her with a strange expression of fear and compassion, Sandy said, "I saw my father lying on the road at the foot of the steep brae by Sir Ewan Campbell's gates, and his een were shut, but for a that he was the same as Uncle Colin." The self-controlled, unemotional Alison Galbraith gave a smothered scream as she listened to her son, and seizing his arm in a passion of fear, with a grip like a vice, said, "Elspeth McPhee was right when she called you an awesome bairn. What for has God in his wrath given me such a child?" And she shook him off, and left him alone in his confused misery. If David Galbraith had not been overcome with drink that night, he would have seen that something terrible had occurred to agitate his wife. But when the drunken fit was spent he noticed that she looked white and ill. "Alison, woman, you keep too close in the house," he said, ye should walk to the sea and breathe the caller air, to bring the colour back to your cheeks. The following Friday was the corn market at Haddington, and David Galbraith, sober, shrewd, and businesslike, set out to attend it, bent on driving a hard bargain. Alison stood at the gate as he mounted his horse to wish him good luck, and to add a word of wifely admonition as to the advisability of not drinking too much whisky before the return journey, and ye'll no be late coming home the night, Davy. There is no night at this time o' year, Alison. And ye'll mind to come by the level road, there's the steep brae beyond the Campbell's gates, and I'd rather ye gave it a wide berth, and came by the long road. Not I, woman. Do ye expect me to mak a midnight ride a mile longer just to avoid a brae that I ken as weel as my ain doorstep? Kelpie'll be sober, goose beast, if his master's not, and he kens every stain on the brae. Ye'll go to bed and leave the house door unlocked for me, and David gave his horse a touch with the whip, and away he trotted. Alison stood till the sound of hoofs had died away and then went back into the house with a boding heart. Sandy returned from school at noon in high spirits, and asked his mother's leave to bring home a schoolfellow to play with him in the afternoon. It was wonderful how his spirits had rallied since his vision of a few days before. It seemed as though his body had now grown strong enough to shake off the ghastly influence entirely. But his mother was shattered both by memory and apprehension. A dreadful restlessness possessed her as night drew on, and after the shouts of the boys at play were over, and silence fell on house and garden, she slipped out unnoticed and walked in the twilight to the beach. It was high midsummer, when in those latitudes the sunset lingers on the western horizon till in the east the vigorous dawn breaks to quench its lesser light. The crescent moon hung low in the sky over the gently murmuring sea that glimmered mysteriously in the diffused twilight, and the brown rocks loomed dark above the water. A time and a place to suggest eerie feelings to the most unimpressionable. But Alison's whole mind was so filled with apprehensions of approaching doom that the scene had no effect upon her. She scarcely noticed where she was. The fear that possessed her was an inward fear, neither suggested nor increased by the aspect of familiar things. She did not meet a soul in her restless wanderings. As she opened the house door on her return, the clock struck 12. Oh, when would David be home? He was seldom later than midnight. Alison needed no light, and creeping softly upstairs she entered Sandy's room, and drawing aside the curtain, by the solemn twilight of the northern night she saw his sleeping face calm and peaceful as an infant's. Did she grudge him his untroubled slumber, that she would rather have found him awake and oppressed with terror as herself? While she stood listening to the beating of her own heart, that sounded louder than the breathing of her child, she heard the first distant sound of approaching hoofs, and as they rapidly drew nearer she recognized Kelpie's familiar steps. "Thank God, he is safe home," she said, and lest her husband should be displeased to find her sitting up for him she hastened to her room and lighted a candle. The horse had stopped opposite the house, and David had had time to dismount, but he had not opened the gate. Someone might be detaining him there. Yet there was no sound of voices to be heard, only Kelpie impatiently striking the ground with one of his 4 feet. Alison looked out of the window, but could see nothing for the high wall. As several minutes passed and still her husband did not come, and the horse stamped with increasing impatience, she slipped downstairs out of doors and across the garden to the gate. So deadly a fear lay upon her spirit that when she flung the gate open and saw Kelpie standing riderless on the dusky highway she felt no surprise, only an assurance that Sandy's vision was about to come true. "Oh, Kelpie lad, your master's no far to seek," she said as she led the trembling, sweating beast towards the stable yard. Then, without calling up any of the men, just as she was with uncovered head, Alison Galbraith sped through the dusk and silence of the summer night. The steep brae by Sir Ewan Campbell's gates. The steep brae by Sir Ewan Campbell's gates, she said to herself as she ran, and when the dark firs and high wall bounding the park came in sight her limbs almost gave way beneath her. Then she reached the great iron gates between granite pillars, and in the twilight she caught sight through their bars of the black avenue within, and heard the wind sigh in the boughs. Alison pressed her hands to her heart and urged herself on. Now a bat cut its zigzag flight through the air and startled her. The white scut of a frightened rabbit shone out in the dusk as it flashed across her path in search of a friendly burrow, and her echoing steps woke many a sleeping bird and set it fluttering with fear. The next turn in the road would bring her to the foot of the brae, and to something that she dared not name that she knew was waiting for her there. She closed her eyes for an instant as she rounded the curve of the road and clenched her hands. Then the soft silence of the summer night was broken by a wailing cry, and Alison Galbraith fell senseless on the dead body of her husband. David was sober that night, but as he rode through the murk lanes the old horror had overtaken him. He thought that he heard a horseman following hard upon him, and clapped spurs to his beast and galloped down the hill, at the foot of which Kelpie slipped on a rolling stone, threw his rider heavily to the ground, and he neither spoke nor moved again. Alison Galbraith did not long survive her husband, and her death took place without Sandy having any intimation of its approach. He never had vision or prophetic foresight again after his father died. The weird gist departed from him with his weakly childhood, and he grew up robust and stout, thriving and commonplace as his forebears. Sandy is even a better farmer than his father before him, and is in a fair way to solve the problem of how to make 2 blades of wheat grow where only one had grown before. He has married a wife, practical and matter-of-fact as himself, and their sons and daughters are as guiltless of imagination as they are of any touch of the uncanny. The burly lowland farmer can never be induced to speak of the second sight, even to his most intimate friends. In the early days of their married life his young wife ventured to ask him about the visions of his childhood, of which she had heard. But he silenced her with such severity that she did not again dare to approach the subject, and she will never know whether the stories of her husband's uncanny childhood are wild legends or plain truth. Many waters cannot quench love. Did I not know my old friend John Horton to be as truthful as he is devoid of imagination, I should have believed that he was romancing or dreaming when he told me of a circumstance that happened to him some 30 years ago. He was at that time a bachelor, living in London and practicing as a solicitor in Bedford Row. He was not a strong man, though neither nervous nor excitable, and as I said before singularly unimaginative. If Horton told you a fact, you might be certain that it had occurred in the precise manner he stated. If he told it you 100 times, he would not vary it in the repetition. This literal and conscientious habit of mind made his testimony of value, and when he told me a fact that I should have disbelieved from any other man, from my friend I was obliged to accept it as truth. It was during the long vacation in the autumn of 1857, that Horton determined to take a few weeks' holiday in the country. He was such an inveterate Londoner he had not been able to tear himself away from town for more than a few days at a time for many years past. But at length he felt the necessity for quiet and pure air, only he would not go far to seek them. It was easier then than it is now to find a lodging that would meet his requirements, a place in the country yet close to the town, and it was near Wandsworth that Horton found what he sought, rooms for a single gentleman in an old farmhouse. He read the advertisement of the lodgings in the paper at luncheon, and went that very afternoon to see if they answered to the tempting description given. He had some little difficulty in finding Maitland's farm. It was not easy to find his way through country lanes that to his town eyes looked precisely alike, and with nothing to indicate whether he had taken a right or wrong turning. The railway now runs shrieking over what were then green fields, lanes have been transformed into gas-lighted streets, and Maitland's farm, the old red brick house standing in its high-walled garden, has been pulled down long ago. The last time Horton went to look at the old place it was changed beyond recognition, and the orchard in which he had gathered pears and apples during his stay at the farm, was now the site of a public house and a dissenting chapel. It was on a hot afternoon early in September when Horton opened the big iron gates and walked up the path bordered with dahlias and hollyhocks leading to the front door, and rang for admittance at Maitland's farm. The bell echoed in a distant part of the empty house and died away into silence, but no one came to answer its summons. As Horton stood waiting, he took the opportunity of thoroughly examining the outside of the house. Though it was called a farm, it had not been built for one originally. It was a substantial, 4-story brick house of Queen Anne's period, with 5 tall sash windows on each floor, and dormer windows in the tiled roof. The front door was approached by a shallow flight of stone steps, and above the fanlight projected a penthouse of solidly carved woodwork. On either side were brackets of wrought iron, supporting extinguishers that had quenched the torch of many a late-returning reveller a century ago. Only the windows to right and left of the door had blinds or curtains, or betrayed any sign of habitation. "Those are the rooms to be let. I wonder which is the bedroom," thought my friend as he rang the bell for the second time. Presently he heard within the sound of approaching footsteps. There was a great drawing of bolts, and after a final struggle with the rusty lock, the door was opened by an old woman of severe and cheerless aspect. Horton was the first to speak. "I have called to see the rooms advertised to be let in this house." The old woman eyed him from head to foot without making any reply, then opening the door wider, nodded to him to enter. He did so and found himself in a large paved hall lighted from the fanlight over the door, and by a high narrow window facing him at the top of a short flight of oak stairs. The air was musty and damp as that of an old church. "A hall this size should have a fire in it," said Horton, glancing at the empty rusty grate. "Farmers and folks that work out of doors keep themselves warm without fires," said the old woman sharply. "This house was never built for a farm. Why is it called one?" inquired Horton of his taciturn guide as she opened the door of the sitting room. "Because it was one," was the blunt reply. "When I was a girl it was the manor house, and may be called that again for all I know, but 30 years since, a man named Maitland took it on a lease and farmed the land, and folks forgot the old name, and called it Maitland's Farm." "When did Maitland leave?" "About 2 months ago." "Why did he go away from a nice place like this?" "You are fond of asking questions," remarked the old woman dryly. "He went for 2 good reasons. His lease was up, and his family was a big one. 9 children he had, from a girl of 22 down to a little lad of 4 years old. His wife and him thought it best to take him out to Australia, where there's room for all. They were glad to go, all but the eldest, Esther, and she nearly broke her heart over it. But then she had to leave her sweetheart behind her. He's a young man on a dairy farm near here, and though he's to follow her out and marry her in 12 months, she did nothing but mourn, same as if she was leaving him altogether." "Ah, indeed," said Horton, who could not readily enter into details about people whom he did not know. "So this is the sitting room. It's large and airy, and has as much furniture in it as a man needs by himself. Now show me the bedroom, if you please." "Follow me upstairs, sir," and the old woman preceded him slowly up the oak staircase, and opened the door of the back room on the first floor. "Then the bedroom that you let is not over the sitting room?" "No, the front room is mine, and the room next to it is my son's. He's out all day at his work, but he sleeps here, and mostly keeps me company of an evening. I'm alone here all day looking after the place, and if you take the rooms I shall cook for you and wait on you myself." Horton liked the look of the bedroom. It was large and airy, with little furniture in it beyond a bed and a chest of drawers. But it was delicately clean, and silent as the grave. How a tired man might sleep here. The walls were decorated with old prints in black frames of the Rake's Progress and Marriage à la mode, and above the high carved mantelpiece hung an engraving of the famous portrait of Charles I, on a prancing brown horse. Those things were on the walls when the Maitlands took the place, and they had to leave 'em where they found 'em, said the old woman. "And they found that sword too," she added, pointing to a rusty cutlass that hung from a nail by the head of the bed, "but I think they'd have done no great harm if they'd sold it for old iron." Horton took down the weapon and examined it. It was an ordinary cutlass, such as was worn by the Marines in George III's reign, not old enough to be of antiquarian interest, nor of sufficient beauty of workmanship to make it of artistic value. He replaced it, and stepped to the windows and looked into the garden below. It was bounded by a high wall enclosing a row of poplars, and beyond lay the open country, visible for miles in the clear air, a sight to rest and fascinate the eye of a Londoner. Horton made his bargain with the old woman whom the landlord had put into the house as caretaker, pending his decision about the disposition of the property. She was allowed to take a lodger for her own profit, and as soon as Mrs. Belt found that the stranger agreed to her terms, she assured him that everything should be comfortably arranged for his reception by the following Wednesday. Horton arrived at Maitland's farm on the evening of the appointed day. A stormy autumnal sunset was casting an angry glow on the windows of the house, the rising wind filled the air with mournful sounds, and the poplars swayed against a background of lurid sky. Mrs. Belt was expecting her lodger, and promptly opened the door, candle in hand, when she heard wheels stopping at the gate. The driver of the fly carried Horton's portmanteau into the hall, was paid his fare, and drove away thinking the darkening lanes more cheerful than the glimpse he had had of the inside of Maitland's farm. Horton was thoroughly pleased with his country quarters. The intense quiet of the almost empty house, that might have made another man melancholy, soothed and rested him. In the daytime he wandered about the country, or amused himself in the garden and orchard, and he spent the long evenings alone, reading and smoking in his sitting-room. Mrs. Belt brought in supper at 9 o'clock, and usually stayed to have a chat with her lodger, and many a long story she related of her neighbours, and the Maitland family, while she waited upon him at his evening meal. On several occasions she told him that Esther Maitland's sweetheart, Michael Wynne, had come to talk with her about the Maitlands, or to bring her a newspaper containing tidings that their ship had reached some point on its long voyage in safety. "You see, the Petrel is a sailing vessel, sir, and there's no saying how long she'll take getting to Australia. The last news Michael had, she'd got as far as some islands with an outlandish name, and he's had a letter from Esther posted at a place called Madeira. And now he gives himself no peace till he can hear that the ship's safe as far as, somewhere, I think he said, in Africa. It would be the Cape, Mrs. Belt." "That's the name, sir, the Cape, and he werrits all the time for fear of storms and shipwrecks. But I tell him the world's a wide place, and the sea wider than all, and very likely when the chimney pots is flying about our heads in a gale here, the Petrel's lying becalmed somewhere. And then he takes up my thought and turns it against me. Yes, he says, and when it's a dead calm here on shore, the ship may be sinking in a storm, and my Esther being drowned. Michael Wynne must be a very nervous young man. That's where it is, sir, and I tell him when he follows the Maitlands it's a good job that he leaves no one behind him that'll werret after him, same as he's werreted after Esther." It was the middle of October, and Horton had been a month at the farm. The weather was now cold and wet, and he began to think it was time he returned to his snug London home, for the autumn rain made everything at Maitland's farm damp and mouldy. It had blown half a gale all day, and the rain had fallen in torrents, keeping him a prisoner indoors. But he occupied himself in writing letters, and reading some legal documents his clerk had brought out to him, and the time passed rapidly. Indeed, the evening flew by so quickly he had no idea it was 9 o'clock, when Mrs. Belt entered the room to lay the cloth for supper. "It's stopped raining now, sir," she said, as she poked the fire into a cheerful blaze, "and a good job too, for Michael Wynne brings me word the Wandle's risen fearful since morning, and it's out in places more than it's been for years. But there's a full moon tonight, so no one need walk into the water unless they've a mind to." Horton's head was too full of a knotty legal point to pay much heed to Mrs. Belt, and the old woman, seeing that he was not in a mood for conversation, said nothing further. At 10:30 she brought her lodger some spirits and hot water, and his bedroom candle, and wished him good night. Horton sat reading for some time, and then made an entry in his diary concerning a day of which there was absolutely nothing to record, lighted his candle, and went upstairs. I am familiar with the precise order of each trifling circumstance. My friend has so often told me the events of that night, and never with the slightest addition or omission in the telling. It was his habit, the last thing at night, to draw up the blinds. He looked out of the window, and though the moon was at the full, the clouds had not yet dispersed, and her light was fitful and obscure. It was 20 minutes to 12 as he extinguished the candle by his bedside. Everything was propitious for rest. He was weary, and the house profoundly silent. The rain had stopped, the wind fallen to a sigh, and it seemed to him that as soon as his head pressed the pillow he sank into a dreamless slumber. Shortly after 2 o'clock, Horton awoke suddenly, passing instantaneously from deep sleep to the possession of every faculty in a heightened degree, and with an insupportable sense of fear weighing upon him like 1,000 nightmares. He started up and looked around him. The perspiration poured from his brow, and his heart beat to suffocation. He was convinced that he had been waked by some strange and terrible noise, that had thrilled through the depths of sleep, and he dreaded the repetition of it inexpressibly. The room was flooded with moonlight streaming through the narrow windows, lying like sheets of molten silver on the floor, and the poplars in the garden cast tremulous shadows on the ceiling. Then Horton heard through the silence of the house a sound that was not the moan of the wind, nor the rustling of trees, nor any sound he had heard before. Clear and distinct, as though it were in the room with him, he heard a voice of weeping and lamentation, with more than human sorrow in the cry, so that it seemed to him as though he listened to the mourning of a lost soul. He leapt up, struck a match, and lighted the candle, and seizing the cutlass that hung by the bed, unlocked the door, and opened it to listen. So far as all ordinary sounds were concerned, the house was silent as death, and the moonlight streamed through the staircase window in a flood of pale light. But the unearthly sound of weeping, thrilling through heart and soul, came from the hall below, and Horton walked downstairs to the landing at the top of the first flight. There, on the lowest step, a woman was seated with bowed head, her face hidden in her hands, rocking to and fro in extremity of grief. The moonlight fell full on her, and he saw that she was only partly clothed, and her dark hair lay in confusion on her bare shoulders. "Who are you, and what is the matter with you?" said Horton, and his trembling voice echoed in the silent house. But she neither stirred nor spoke, nor abated her weeping. Slowly he descended the moonlit staircase till there were but 4 steps between him and the woman. A mortal fear was growing upon him. "Speak! If you are a living being!" he cried. The figure rose to its full height, turned and faced him for a moment that seemed an eternity, and rushed full on the point of the cutlass Horton involuntarily presented. As the impalpable form glided up the blade of the weapon, a cold wave seemed to break over him, and he fell in a dead faint on the stairs. How long he remained insensible he could not tell. When he came to himself and opened his eyes, the moon had set, and he groped his way in darkness to his room, where the candle had burnt itself out. When Horton came down to breakfast, he looked as though he had been ill for a month, and his hands trembled like a drunkard's. At any other time Mrs. Belt would have been struck by his appearance, but this morning she was too much excited by some bad news she had heard, to notice whether her lodger was looking well or ill. Horton asked her how she had slept, for if she had not heard the terrible sounds that waked him, it still seemed impossible she should not have heard his heavy fall on the stairs. Mrs. Belt replied, with some astonishment at her lodger's concern for her welfare, that she had never had a better night, it was so quiet after the wind fell. "But did your son think the house was quiet, did he sleep too?" asked Horton with feverish eagerness. Mrs. Belt was yearning to impart her bad news to her lodger, and remarking that she had something else to do than ask folks how they slept o' nights, she said a neighbour had just told her that Michael Wynne had fallen into the Wandle during the night, no one knew how, and was drowned, and they were carrying his body home then. "What a terrible blow for his sweetheart," said Horton, greatly shocked. There's a pretty piece of news to send her, when she's expecting to see poor Michael himself soon. Mrs. Belt, have you any portrait of Esther Maitland you could show me? I've heard the girl's name so often I'm curious to know what she is like. And the old woman retired to hunt among her treasures for a small photograph on glass, that Esther had given her before she went away. Presently Mrs. Belt returned, polishing the picture with her apron. It's but a poor affair, sir, taken in a caravan on the common, yet it's like the girl, it's very like. It was a miserable production, a cheap and early effort in photography, and Horton rose from the table with the picture in his hand to examine it at the window. And there, surrounded by the thin brass frame, he recognized the face of all faces that had dismayed him, the face he beheld in the vision of the preceding night. He suppressed a groan, and turned from the window with a face so white, that, as he handed the picture back to Mrs. Belt, she said, "You're not feeling well this morning, sir." "No, I'm feeling very ill. I must get back to town today to be near to my own doctor. You shall be no loser by my leaving you so suddenly, but if I am going to be ill, I am best in my own home." For Horton could not have stayed another night at Maitland's farm to save his life. He was at his office in Bedford Row by noon, and his clerks thought that he looked 10 years older for his visit to the country. A little more than 3 weeks after Horton returned to town, when his nerves were beginning to recover their accustomed tone, his attention was unexpectedly recalled to the abhorrent subject of the apparition he had seen. He read in his daily paper that the mail from the Cape had brought news of the wreck of the sailing vessel Petrel bound for Australia, with loss of all on board, in a violent storm off the coast, shortly before the steamer left for England. By a careful comparison of dates, allowing for the variation of time, the conviction was forced upon John Horton that the ill-fated ship foundered at the very hour in which he beheld the wraith of Esther Maitland. She and her lover, divided by thousands of miles, both perished by drowning at the same time, Michael Wynne in the little river at home, and Esther Maitland in the depths of a distant ocean. The real, and the counterfeit. Will Musgrave determined that he would neither keep Christmas alone, nor spend it again with his parents and sisters in the south of France. The Musgrave family annually migrated southward from their home in Northumberland, and Will as regularly followed them to spend a month with them in the Riviera, till he had almost forgotten what Christmas was like in England. He rebelled at having to leave the country at a time when, if the weather was mild, he should be hunting, or if it was severe, skating, and he had no real or imaginary need to winter in the south. His chest was of iron, and his lungs of brass. A raking east wind that drove his parents into their thickest furs, and taught them the number of their teeth by enabling them to count a separate and well-defined ache for each, only brought a deeper color into the cheek, and a brighter light into the eye of the weatherproof youth. Decidedly he would not go to Cannes, though it was no use annoying his father and mother, and disappointing his sisters, by telling them beforehand of his determination. Will knew very well how to write a letter to his mother in which his defection should appear as an event brought about by the overmastering power of circumstances, to which the sons of Adam must submit. No doubt that a prospect of hunting or skating, as the fates might decree, influenced his decision. But he had also long promised himself the pleasure of a visit from 2 of his college friends, Hugh Armitage and Horace Lawley, and he asked that they might spend a fortnight with him at Stonecroft, as a little relaxation had been positively ordered for him by his tutor. "Bless him," said his mother fondly, when she had read his letter, "I will write to the dear boy and tell him how pleased I am with his firmness and determination." But Mr. Musgrave muttered inarticulate sounds as he listened to his wife, expressive of incredulity rather than of acquiescence, and when he spoke it was to say, "Devil of a row 3 young fellows will kick up alone at Stonecroft. We shall find the stables full of broken-kneed horses when we go home again." Will Musgrave spent Christmas Day with the Armitages at their place near Ripon. And the following night they gave a dance at which he enjoyed himself as only a very young man can do, who has not yet had his fill of dancing, and who would like nothing better than to waltz through life with his arm round his pretty partner's waist. The following day, Musgrave and Armitage left for Stonecroft, picking up Lawley on the way, and arriving at their destination late in the evening, in the highest spirits and with the keenest appetites. Stonecroft was a delightful haven of refuge at the end of a long journey across country in bitter weather, when the east wind was driving the light dry snow into every nook and cranny. The wide, hospitable front door opened into an oak-panelled hall with a great open fire burning cheerily, and lighted by lamps from overhead that effectually dispelled all gloomy shadows. As soon as Musgrave had entered the house he seized his friends, and before they had time to shake the snow from their coats, kissed them both under the mistletoe bough and set the servants tittering in the background. "You're miserable substitutes for your betters," he said, laughing and pushing them from him, "but it's awfully unlucky not to use the mistletoe. Barker, I hope supper's ready, and that it is something very hot and plenty of it, for we've travelled on empty stomachs and brought them with us," and he led his guests upstairs to their rooms. "What a jolly gallery!" said Lawley enthusiastically as they entered a long wide corridor, with many doors and several windows in it, and hung with pictures and trophies of arms. "Yes, it's our one distinguishing feature at Stonecroft," said Musgrave. "It runs the whole length of the house, from the modern end of it to the back, which is very old, and built on the foundations of a Cistercian monastery which once stood on this spot. The gallery is wide enough to drive a carriage and pair down it, and it's the main thoroughfare of the house. My mother takes a constitutional here in bad weather, as though it were the open air, and does it with her bonnet on to aid the delusion." Armitage's attention was attracted by the pictures on the walls, and especially by the life-size portrait of a young man in a blue coat, with powdered hair, sitting under a tree with a stag-hound lying at his feet. "An ancestor of yours?" he said, pointing at the picture. "Oh, they're all one's ancestors, and a motley crew they are, I must say for them. It may amuse you and Lawley to find from which of them I derive my good looks. That pretty youth whom you seem to admire is my great-great-grandfather. He died at 22, a preposterous age for an ancestor. But come along, Armitage, you'll have plenty of time to do justice to the pictures by daylight, and I want to show you your rooms. I see everything is arranged comfortably, we are close together. Our pleasantest rooms are on the gallery, and here we are nearly at the end of it. Your rooms are opposite to mine, and open into Lawley's in case you should be nervous in the night and feel lonely so far from home, my dear children." And Musgrave bade his friends make haste, and hurried away whistling cheerfully to his own room. The following morning the friends rose to a white world. 6 inches of fine snow, dry as salt, lay everywhere, the sky overhead a leaden lid, and all the signs of a deep fall yet to come. "Cheerful this, very," said Lawley, as he stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out of the window after breakfast. "The snow will have spoilt the ice for skating. But it won't prevent wild duck shooting," said Armitage, "and I say, Musgrave, we'll rig up a toboggan out there. I see a slope that might have been made on purpose for it. If we get some tobogganing, it may snow day and night for all I care, we shall be masters of the situation anyway." "Well thought of, Armitage," said Musgrave, jumping at the idea. "Yes, but you need 2 slopes and a little valley between for real good tobogganing," objected Lawley, "otherwise you only rush down the hillock like you do from the Mount Church to Funchal, and then have to retrace your steps as you do there, carrying your car on your back. Which lessens the fun considerably." "Well, we can only work with the material at hand," said Armitage. "Let's go and see if we can't find a better place for our toboggan, and something that will do for a car to slide in." "That's easily found, empty wine cases are the thing, and stout sticks to steer with," and away rushed the young men into the open air, followed by half a dozen dogs barking joyfully. "By Jove! If the snow keeps firm, we'll put runners on strong chairs and walk over to see the Harradines at Garthside, and ask the girls to come out sledging, and we'll push them," shouted Musgrave to Lawley and Armitage, who had outrun him in the vain attempt to keep up with a deerhound that headed the party. After a long and careful search they found a piece of land exactly suited to their purpose, and it would have amused their friends to see how hard the young men worked under the beguiling name of pleasure. For 4 hours they worked like navvies making a toboggan slide. They shoveled away the snow, then with pickaxe and spade, leveled the ground, so that when a carpet of fresh snow was spread over it, their improvised car would run down a steep incline and be carried by the impetus up another, till it came to a standstill in a snowdrift. "If we can only get this bit of engineering done today," said Lawley, chucking a spadeful of earth aside as he spoke, "the slide will be in perfect order for tomorrow?" "Yes, and when once it's done forever," said Armitage, working away cheerfully with his pick where the ground was frozen hard and full of stones, and cleverly keeping his balance on the slope as he did so. "Good work lasts no end of a time, and posterity will bless us for leaving them this magnificent slide." "Posterity may, my dear fellow, but hardly our progenitors if my father should happen to slip down it," said Musgrave. When their task was finished, and the friends were transformed in appearance from navvies into gentlemen, they set out through thick falling snow to walk to Garthside to call on their neighbours the Harradines. They had earned their pleasant tea and lively talk, their blood was still aglow from their exhilarating work, and their spirits at the highest point. They did not return to Stonecroft till they had compelled the girls to name a time when they would come with their brothers and be launched down the scientifically prepared slide, in wine cases well padded with cushions for the occasion. Late that night the young men sat smoking and chatting together in the library. They had played billiards till they were tired, and Lawley had sung sentimental songs, accompanying himself on the banjo, till even he was weary, to say nothing of what his listeners might be. Armitage sat leaning his light curly head back in the chair, gently puffing out a cloud of tobacco smoke. And he was the first to break the silence that had fallen on the little company. "Musgrave," he said suddenly, "an old house is not complete unless it is haunted. You ought to have a ghost of your own at Stonecroft." Musgrave threw down the yellow-backed novel he had just picked up, and became all attention. "So we have, my dear fellow. Only it has not been seen by any of us since my grandfather's time. It is the desire of my life to become personally acquainted with our family ghost." Armitage laughed. But Lawley said, "You would not say that if you really believed in ghosts." "I believe in them most devoutly, but I naturally wish to have my faith confirmed by sight." "You believe in them too, I can see. Then you see what does not exist, and so far you are in a fair way to see ghosts." "No, my state of mind is this," continued Lawley, "I neither believe, nor entirely disbelieve in ghosts. I am open to conviction on the subject. Many men of sound judgment believe in them, and others of equally good mental capacity don't believe in them. I merely regard the case of the bogies as not proven. They may, or may not exist, but till their existence is plainly demonstrated, I decline to add such an uncomfortable article to my creed as a belief in bogies." Musgrave did not reply, but Armitage laughed a strident laugh. "I'm one against two, I'm in an overwhelming minority," he said. "Musgrave frankly confesses his belief in ghosts, and you are neutral, neither believing nor disbelieving, but open to conviction. Now I'm a complete unbeliever in the supernatural, root and branch. People's nerves no doubt play them queer tricks, and will continue to do so to the end of the chapter, and if I were so fortunate as to see Musgrave's family ghost tonight, I should no more believe in it than I do now. By the way, Musgrave, is the ghost a lady or a gentleman?" he asked flippantly. "I don't think you deserve to be told. Don't you know that a ghost is neither he nor she?" said Lawley. "Like a corpse, it is always it. That is a piece of very definite information from a man who neither believes nor disbelieves in ghosts." "How do you come by it, Lawley?" asked Armitage. "Mayn't a man be well informed on a subject although he suspends his judgment about it? I think I have the only logical mind among us. Musgrave believes in ghosts though he has never seen one. You don't believe in them, and say that you would not be convinced if you saw one, which is not wise, it seems to me. It is not necessary to my peace of mind to have a definite opinion on the subject. After all, it is only a matter of patience, for if ghosts really exist we shall each be one in the course of time, and then, if we've nothing better to do, and are allowed to play such unworthy pranks, we may appear again on the scene, and impartially scare our credulous and incredulous surviving friends. Then I shall try to be beforehand with you, Lawley, and turn bogey first. It would suit me better to scare than to be scared. But, Musgrave, do tell me about your family ghost. I'm really interested in it, and I'm quite respectful now. Well, mind you are, and I shall have no objection to tell you what I know about it, which is briefly this: Stonecroft, as I told you, is built on the site of an old Cistercian monastery destroyed at the time of the Reformation. The back part of the house rests on the old foundations, and its walls are built with the stones that were once part and parcel of the monastery. The ghost that has been seen by members of the Musgrave family for 3 centuries past, is that of a Cistercian monk, dressed in the white habit of his order. Who he was, or why he has haunted the scenes of his earthly life so long, there is no tradition to enlighten us. The ghost has usually been seen once or twice in each generation. But as I said, it has not visited us since my grandfather's time, so, like a comet, it should be due again presently. How you must regret that was before your time, said Armitage. Of course I do, but I don't despair of seeing it yet. At least I know where to look for it. It has always made its appearance in the gallery, and I have my bedroom close to the spot where it was last seen, in the hope that if I open my door suddenly some moonlight night I may find the monk standing there. Standing where? Asked the incredulous Armitage. In the gallery, to be sure, midway between your 2 doors and mine. That is where my grandfather last saw it. He was waked in the dead of night by the sound of a heavy door shutting. He ran into the gallery where the noise came from, and, standing opposite the door of the room I occupy, was the white figure of the Cistercian monk. As he looked, it glided the length of the gallery and melted like mist into the wall. The spot where he disappeared is on the old foundations of the monastery, so that he was evidently returning to his own quarters. And your grandfather believed that he saw a ghost? Asked Armitage disdainfully. Could he doubt the evidence of his senses? He saw the thing as clearly as we see each other now, and it disappeared like a thin vapor against the wall. My dear fellow, don't you think that it sounds more like an anecdote of your grandmother than of your grandfather? Remarked Armitage. He did not intend to be rude, though he succeeded in being so, as he was instantly aware by the expression of cold reserve that came over Musgrave's frank face. Forgive me, but I never can take a ghost story seriously, he said. But this much I will concede: they may have existed long ago in what were literally the Dark Ages, when rushlights and sputtering dip candles could not keep the shadows at bay. But in this latter part of the 19th century, when gas and the electric light have turned night into day, you have destroyed the very conditions that produced the ghost, or rather the belief in it, which is the same thing. Darkness has always been bad for human nerves. I can't explain why, but so it is. My mother was in advance of the age on the subject, and always insisted on having a good light burning in the night nursery, so that when as a child I woke from a bad dream I was never frightened by the darkness. And in consequence I have grown up a complete unbeliever in ghosts, spectres, wraiths, apparitions, doppelgangers, and the whole bogey crew of them. And Armitage looked round calmly and complacently. Perhaps I might have felt as you do if I had not begun life with the knowledge that our house was haunted, replied Musgrave with visible pride in the ancestral ghost. I only wish that I could convince you of the existence of the supernatural from my own personal experience. I always feel it to be the weak point in a ghost story, that it is never told in the first person. It is a friend, or a friend of one's friend, who was the lucky man, and actually saw the ghost. And Armitage registered a vow to himself, that within a week from that time Musgrave should see his family ghost with his own eyes, and ever after be able to speak with his enemy in the gate. Several ingenious schemes occurred to his inventive mind for producing the desired apparition. But he had to keep them burning in his breast. Lawley was the last man to aid and abet him in playing a practical joke on their host, and he feared he should have to work without an ally. And though he would have enjoyed his help and sympathy, it struck him that it would be a double triumph achieved, if both his friends should see the Cistercian monk. Musgrave already believed in ghosts, and was prepared to meet one more than halfway, and Lawley, though he pretended to a judicial and impartial mind concerning them, was not unwilling to be convinced of their existence, if it could be visibly demonstrated to him. Armitage became more cheerful than usual as circumstances favoured his impious plot. The weather was propitious for the attempt he meditated, as the moon rose late and was approaching the full. On consulting the almanac he saw with delight that 3 nights hence she would rise at 2 a.m., and an hour later the end of the gallery nearest Musgrave's room would be flooded with her light. Though Armitage could not have an accomplice under the roof, he needed one within reach, who could use needle and thread, to run up a specious imitation of the white robe and hood of a Cistercian monk. And the next day, when they went to the Harradines to take the girls out in their improvised sledges, it fell to his lot to take charge of the youngest Miss Harradine. As he pushed the low chair on runners over the hard snow, nothing was easier than to bend forward and whisper to Kate, "I am going to take you as fast as I can, so that no one can hear what we are saying. I want you to be very kind, and help me to play a perfectly harmless practical joke on Musgrave. Will you promise to keep my secret for a couple of days, when we shall all enjoy a laugh over it together?" "Oh yes, I'll help you with pleasure, but make haste and tell me what your practical joke is to be." "I want to play ancestral ghost to Musgrave, and make him believe that he has seen the Cistercian monk in his white robe and cowl, that was last seen by his respected credulous grandpapa." "What a good idea! I know he is always longing to see the ghost, and takes it as a personal affront that it has never appeared to him. But might it not startle him more than you intend?" And Kate turned her glowing face towards him, and Armitage involuntarily stopped the little sledge. For it is one thing to wish to see a ghost, you know, and quite another to think that you see it. "Oh, you need not fear for Musgrave. We shall be conferring a positive favour on him, in helping him to see what he's so wishful to see. I'm arranging it so that Lawley shall have the benefit of the show as well, and see the ghost at the same time with him. And if 2 strong men are not a match for one bogey, leave alone a homemade counterfeit one, it's a pity. Well, if you think it's a safe trick to play, no doubt you are right. But how can I help you? With the monk's habit, I suppose." "Exactly. I shall be so grateful to you if you will run up some sort of garment, that will look passably like a white Cistercian habit to a couple of men, who I don't think will be in a critical frame of mind during the short time they are allowed to see it. I really wouldn't trouble you if I were anything of a sempster, is that the masculine of sempstress? Myself, but I'm not. A thimble bothers me very much, and at college when I have to sew on a button, I push the needle through on one side with a 3-penny bit, and pull it out on the other with my teeth, and it's a laborious process." Kate laughed merrily. "Oh, I can easily make something or other out of a white dressing gown, fit for a ghost to wear, and fasten a hood to it." Armitage then told her the details of his deeply laid scheme, how he would go to his room when Musgrave and Lawley went to theirs on the eventful night, and sit up till he was sure that they were fast asleep. Then when the moon had risen, and if her light was obscured by clouds he would be obliged to postpone the entertainment till he could be sure of her aid, he would dress himself as the ghostly monk, put out the candles, softly open the door and look into the gallery to see that all was ready. Then I shall slam the door with an awful bang, for that was the noise that heralded the ghost's last appearance, and it will wake Musgrave and Lawley, and bring them both out of their rooms like a shot. Lawley's door is next to mine, and Musgrave's opposite, so that each will command a magnificent view of the monk at the same instant, and they can compare notes afterwards at their leisure. But what shall you do if they find you out at once? Oh, they won't do that. The cowl will be drawn over my face, and I shall stand with my back to the moonlight. My private belief is, that in spite of Musgrave's yearnings after a ghost, he won't like it when he thinks he sees it. Nor will Lawley, and I expect they'll dart back into their rooms and lock themselves in as soon as they catch sight of the monk. That would give me time to whip back into my room, turn the key, strip off my finery, hide it, and be roused with difficulty from a deep sleep when they come knocking at my door to tell me what a horrible thing has happened. And one more ghost story will be added to those already in circulation, and Armitage laughed aloud in anticipation of the fun. It is to be hoped that everything will happen just as you have planned it, and then we shall all be pleased. And now will you turn the sledge round and let us join the others? We have done conspiring for the present. If we are seen talking so exclusively to each other, they will suspect that we are brewing some mischief together. Oh, how cold the wind is! I like to hear it whistle in my hair," said Kate as Armitage deftly swung the little sledge round and drove it quickly before him, facing the keen north wind, and she buried her chin in her warm furs. Armitage found an opportunity to arrange with Kate that he would meet her halfway between Stonecroft and her home, on the afternoon of the next day but one, when she would give him a parcel containing the monk's habit. The Harradines and their house party were coming on Thursday afternoon to try the toboggan slide at Stonecroft. But Kate and Armitage were willing to sacrifice their pleasure to the business they had in hand. There was no other way but for the conspirators to give their friends the slip for a couple of hours, when the important parcel would be safely given to Armitage, secretly conveyed by him to his own room, and locked up till he should want it in the small hours of the morning. When the young people arrived at Stonecroft, Miss Harradine apologized for her younger sister's absence, occasioned, she said, by a severe headache. Armitage's heart beat rapidly when he heard the excuse, and he thought how convenient it was for the inscrutable sex to be able to turn on a headache at will, as one turns on hot or cold water from a tap. After luncheon, as there were more gentlemen than ladies, and Armitage's services were not necessary at the toboggan slide, he elected to take the dogs for a walk, and set off in the gayest spirits to keep his appointment with Kate. Much as he enjoyed maturing his ghost plot, he enjoyed still more the confidential talks with Kate that had sprung out of it, and he was sorry that this was to be the last of them. But the moon in heaven could not be stayed for the performance of his little comedy, and her light was necessary to its due performance. The ghost must be seen at 3 o'clock next morning, at the time and place arranged, when the proper illumination for its display would be forthcoming. As Armitage walked swiftly over the hard snow, he caught sight of Kate at a distance. She waved her hand gaily and pointed smiling to the rather large parcel she was carrying. The red glow of the winter sun shone full upon her, bringing out the warm tints in her chestnut hair, and filling her brown eyes with soft luster, and Armitage looked at her with undisguised admiration. "It's awfully good of you to help me so kindly," he said as he took the parcel from her, "and I shall come round tomorrow to tell you the result of our practical joke. But how is the headache?" he asked smiling. "You look so unlike aches or pains of any kind, I was forgetting to inquire about it." "Thank you, it is better." It was not altogether a made-up headache, though it happened opportunely. "I was awake in the night, not in the least repenting that I was helping you, of course, but wishing it was all well over. One has heard of this kind of trick sometimes proving too successful, of people being frightened out of their wits by a make-believe ghost, and I should never forgive myself if Mr. Musgrave or Mr. Lawley were seriously alarmed. Really, Miss Harradine, I don't think that you need give yourself a moment's anxiety about the nerves of a couple of burly young men. If you are afraid for anyone, let it be for me. If they find me out, they will fall upon me and rend me limb from limb on the spot. I can assure you I am the only one for whom there is anything to fear," and the transient gravity passed like a cloud from Kate's bright face. And she admitted that it was rather absurd to be uneasy about two stalwart young men compounded more of muscle than of nerves. And they parted, Kate hastening home as the early twilight fell, and Armitage, after watching her out of sight, retracing his steps with the precious parcel under his arm. He entered the house unobserved, and reaching the gallery by a back staircase, felt his way in the dark to his room. He deposited his treasure in the wardrobe, locked it up, and attracted by the sound of laughter, ran downstairs to the drawing-room. Will Musgrave and his friends, after a couple of hours of glowing exercise, had been driven indoors by the darkness, nothing loath to partake of tea and hot cakes, while they talked and laughed over the adventures of the afternoon. "Wherever have you been, old fellow?" said Musgrave as Armitage entered the room. "I believe you've a private toboggan of your own somewhere that you keep quiet. If only the moon rose at a decent time, instead of at some unearthly hour in the night, when it's not of the slightest use to anyone, we would have gone out looking for you. You wouldn't have had far to seek, you'd have met me on the turnpike road. But why this subdued and chastened taste? Imagine preferring a constitutional on the high road when you might have been tobogganing with us. My poor friend, I'm afraid you are not feeling well," said Musgrave with an affectation of sympathy that ended in boyish laughter and a wrestling match between the two young men, in the course of which Lawley more than once saved the tea-table from being violently overthrown. Presently, when the cakes and toast had disappeared before the youthful appetites, lanterns were lighted, and Musgrave and his friends, and the Harradine brothers, set out as a bodyguard to take the young ladies home. Armitage was in riotous spirits, and finding that Musgrave and Lawley had appropriated the two prettiest girls in the company, waltzed untrammelled along the road before them lantern in hand, like a very will-o'-the-wisp. The young people did not part till they had planned fresh pleasures for the morrow, and Musgrave, Lawley, and Armitage returned to Stonecroft to dinner, making the thin air ring to the jovial songs with which they beguiled the homeward journey. Late in the evening, when the young men were sitting in the library, Musgrave suddenly exclaimed, as he reached down a book from an upper shelf, "Hello! I've come on my grandfather's diary. Here's his own account of how he saw the White Monk in the gallery. Lawley, you may read it if you like, but it shan't be wasted on an unbeliever like Armitage. By Jove! What an odd coincidence. It's 40 years this very night, the 30th of December, since he saw the ghost," and he handed the book to Lawley, who read Mr. Musgrave's narrative with close attention. "Is it a case of almost thou persuadest me?" asked Armitage, looking at his intent and knitted brow. "I hardly know what I think. Nothing positive either way at any rate." And he dropped the subject, for he saw Musgrave did not wish to discuss the family ghost in Armitage's unsympathetic presence. They retired late, and the hour that Armitage had so gleefully anticipated drew near. "Good night both of you," said Musgrave as he entered his room, "I shall be asleep in 5 minutes. All this exercise in the open air makes a man absurdly sleepy at night," and the young men closed their doors, and silence settled down upon Stonecroft Hall. Armitage and Lawley's rooms were next to each other, and in less than a quarter of an hour Lawley shouted a cheery good night, which was loudly returned by his friend. Then Armitage felt somewhat mean and stealthy. Musgrave and Lawley were both confidingly asleep, while he sat up alert and vigilant, maturing a mischievous plot that had for its object the awakening and scaring of both the innocent sleepers. He dared not smoke to pass the tedious time, lest the telltale fumes should penetrate into the next room through the keyhole, and inform Lawley if he woke for an instant that his friend was awake too, and behaving as though it were high noon. Armitage spread the monk's white habit on the bed, and smiled as he touched it to think that Kate's pretty fingers had been so recently at work upon it. He need not put it on for a couple of hours yet, and to occupy the time he sat down to write. He would have liked to take a nap. But he knew that if he once yielded to sleep, nothing would wake him till he was called at 8 o'clock in the morning. As he bent over his desk, the big clock in the hall struck 1, so suddenly and sharply it was like a blow on the head, and he started violently. What a swinish sleep Lawley must be in that he can't hear a noise like that, he thought, as snoring became audible from the next room. Then he drew the candles nearer to him, and settled once more to his writing, and a pile of letters testified to his industry, when again the clock struck. But this time he expected it, and it did not startle him, only the cold made him shiver. If I hadn't made up my mind to go through with this confounded piece of folly, I'd go to bed now, he thought, but I can't break faith with Kate. She's made the robe and I've got to wear it, worse luck, and with a great yawn, he threw down his pen, and rose to look out of the window. It was a clear frosty night. At the edge of the dark sky, sprinkled with stars, a faint band of cold light heralded the rising moon. How different from the grey light of dawn, that ushers in the cheerful day, is the solemn rising of the moon in the depth of a winter night. Her light is not to rouse a sleeping world and lead men forth to their labour, it falls on the closed eyes of the weary, and silvers the graves of those whose rest shall be broken no more. Armitage was not easily impressed by the sombre aspect of nature, though he was quick to feel her gay and cheerful influence, but he would be glad when the farce was over, and he no longer obliged to watch the rise and spread of the pale light, solemn as the dawn of the last day. He turned from the window, and proceeded to make himself into the best imitation of a Cistercian monk that he could contrive. He slipped the white habit over all his clothing, that he might seem of portly size, and marked dark circles round his eyes, and thickly powdered his face a ghastly white. Armitage silently laughed at his reflection in the glass, and wished that Kate could see him now. Then he softly opened the door and looked into the gallery. The moonlight was shimmering duskily on the end window to the right of his door and Lawley's. It would soon be where he wanted it, and neither too light nor too dark for the success of his plan. He stepped silently back again to wait, and a feeling as much akin to nervousness as he had ever known came over him. His heart beat rapidly, he started like a timid girl when the silence was suddenly broken by the hooting of an owl. He no longer cared to look at himself in the glass. He had taken fright at the mortal pallor of his powdered face. Hang it all! I wish Lawley hadn't left off snoring. It was quite companionable to hear him. And again he looked into the gallery, and now the moon shed her cold beams where he intended to stand. He put out the light and opened the door wide, and stepping into the gallery threw it to with an echoing slam that only caused Musgrave and Lawley to start and turn on their pillows. Armitage stood dressed as the ghostly monk of Stonecroft, in the pale moonlight in the middle of the gallery, waiting for the door on either side to fly open and reveal the terrified faces of his friends. He had time to curse the ill luck that made them sleep so heavily that night of all nights, and to fear lest the servants had heard the noise their master had been deaf to, and would come hurrying to the spot and spoil the sport. But no one came, and as Armitage stood, the objects in the long gallery became clearer every moment, as his sight accommodated itself to the dim light. I never noticed before that there was a mirror at the end of the gallery. I should not have believed the moonlight was bright enough for me to see my own reflection so far off, only white stands out so in the dark. But is it my own reflection? Confound it all, the thing's moving and I'm standing still. I know what it is. It's Musgrave dressed up to try to give me a fright, and Lawley's helping him. They've forestalled me, that's why they didn't come out of their rooms when I made a noise fit to wake the dead. Odd we're both playing the same practical joke at the same moment. Come on, my counterfeit bogey, and we'll see which of us turns white-livered first. But to Armitage's surprise, that rapidly became terror, the white figure that he believed to be Musgrave disguised, and like himself playing ghost, advanced towards him, slowly gliding over the floor which its feet did not touch. Armitage's courage was high, and he determined to hold his ground against the something ingeniously contrived by Musgrave and Lawley to terrify him into belief in the supernatural. But a feeling was creeping over the strong young man that he had never known before. He opened his dry mouth as the thing floated towards him, and there issued a hoarse inarticulate cry, that woke Musgrave and Lawley and brought them to their doors in a moment, not knowing by what strange fright they had been startled out of their sleep. Do not think them cowards that they shrank back appalled from the ghostly forms the moonlight revealed to them in the gallery. But as Armitage vehemently repelled the horror that drifted nearer and nearer to him, the cowl slipped from his head, and his friends recognized his white face, distorted by fear, and, springing towards him as he staggered, supported him in their arms. The Cistercian monk passed them like a white mist that sank into the wall, and Musgrave and Lawley were alone with the dead body of their friend, whose masquerading dress had become his shroud.